Welcome to Stories of Slavery. Today we're heading back to 1849, following Ruth, a black girl with striking blue eyes, who relied on her sharp mind to cheat death, when everyone around her insisted she had no way out. What followed was deliberately concealed, and one single truth could end her life. This is a heavy and intense story, so take a moment, breathe deep, and listen carefully before we dive in. Please subscribe to the channel and drop a comment letting us know which city and country you're listening from. Your engagement helps ensure these stories stay alive and remembered, rather than lost to time. Let's begin. On the night of August 12, 1832, inside a wooden shack tucked behind the cotton fields of the Harrow plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, a baby girl entered the world. A child who was meant to be killed within her first hour. The midwife who caught her, an enslaved woman named Hattie, who had delivered over 200 babies on that very plantation, took one look at the newborn and felt her blood run cold. The baby was healthy. The baby was strong. She had 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a cry that pierced the humid Mississippi night. But she also had something that made Hattie's hands shake as she held her. The baby had blue eyes, not the hazy, shifting color that many newborns have before their true eye color sets in. These eyes were already distinct, already vivid, already unmistakably blue. Blue like cornflowers, blue like the summer sky over the cotton fields, blue like the eyes of Master Thomas Hargrove, who owned every soul on that plantation and had visited that shack on countless nights, while his wife slept. Hattie had been delivering babies for 31 years. She knew exactly what those blue eyes meant. She knew what would happen when the mistress found out. And she knew she had maybe 10 minutes to make a choice that would either spare this child or cost her own life. The mother was Josephine, 23 years old, purchased by Thomas Hargrove 6 years earlier at a slave auction in Natchez. She was what the traders called a fancy girl, a term that made Hattie's stomach churn every time she heard it. It meant Josephine was considered beautiful by white standards, that her skin was lighter than most, that she would command a higher price because men like Thomas Hargrove would pay extra for women they intended to use beyond field work. Josephine had known what awaited her when she was bought. She had endured it because the alternative was death or worse, and now she lay exhausted on a straw mattress, gazing at her daughter, understanding immediately what those blue eyes would cost them both. The mistress of the Hargrove plantation was Elizabeth, and she was no fool. She knew what her husband did on nights when he claimed to be checking livestock or inspecting the slave quarters. She knew about the children born on that plantation with a lighter skin than their mothers and features that echoed her husband's face. She had learned to ignore those children, to pretend they didn't exist, to uphold the fiction that her marriage was respectable and her husband faithful. But there were limits. Blue eyes crossed that line. Blue eyes were evidence that couldn't be explained away. Blue eyes would make other plantation owners whisper, and the ladies at church gatherings exchange knowing glances. Blue eyes were an insult Elizabeth Hargrove would not tolerate. When word reached the big house that Josephine had given birth, Elizabeth came to see for herself. She walked across the yard in the darkness, her white nightgown billowing in the warm August breeze, her face set in an expression Hattie recognized as barely contained rage. She entered the shack without knocking. Enslaved people had no right to privacy, and looked down at the baby in Hattie's arms. She saw the blue eyes. She saw her husband's eyes staring back at her from the face of a black child. And she gave the order Hattie had been dreading. Elizabeth Hargrove didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She simply said the child was an abomination, should never have been born, and Hattie should take care of it. before morning. Everyone in that room understood what "take care of it" meant. It meant Hattie was being ordered to kill a newborn. It meant Josephine would watch her daughter die within hours of giving birth. It meant the evidence of Thomas Hargrove's crimes would be buried in an unmarked grave behind the slave quarters, and life on the plantation would continue as if nothing had happened. But Hattie had delivered too many babies to follow that order. She had held too many newborns, felt too many tiny hearts beating against her chest, watched too many children grow into adults who worked the same fields their parents had worked. She could not kill this child, not even to save herself. So she did something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She lied. She told Elizabeth she would handle the situation, that the mistress should return to the big house and not trouble herself with such unpleasant matters. And when Elizabeth left, satisfied that her orders would be obeyed, Hattie wrapped the baby in the cleanest rag she could find and carried her out into the night. The slave cemetery sat at the edge of the plantation in a grove of oak trees that provided shade during brutal Mississippi summers. It was where enslaved people buried their dead, marking graves with wooden crosses that rotted within a few years and stones that sank into the soft earth over time. No white person ever visited the slave cemetery. It was considered beneath their notice, a place for property to dispose of other property. This made it the perfect hiding spot for a child who was supposed to be dead. For 3 days and 3 nights, baby Ruth lived among the graves of those who had died before her. Hattie and 2 other women took turns sneaking out to feed her, using rags soaked in goat's milk because Josephine couldn't come without arousing suspicion. They covered the baby's mouth when she cried, terrified someone would hear and discover their deception. They prayed over her, asking God to protect this child who had done nothing wrong except be born with the wrong color eyes. And on the 4th night, when a slave trader passed through on his way to Vicksburg, they found a way to smuggle Ruth off the Hargrove plantation forever. The trader's name was Samuel Meeks, and he was exactly the kind of man most enslaved people feared. He bought and sold human beings the way other men bought and sold livestock, calculating prices based on age, health, and potential productivity. But Meeks also had a reputation for accepting bribes, for looking the other way when paperwork didn't quite match the merchandise, for facilitating transactions plantation owners preferred to keep unofficial. Hattie had saved for years, hiding coins she earned from selling eggs and vegetables to travelers passing through the area. She gave Meeks everything she had, nearly $12, in exchange for taking the baby and selling her to a plantation far enough away that no one would ever connect her to the Hargroves. Ruth was sold 3 times before her 1st birthday. She passed through the hands of traders in Vicksburg, then Natchez, then finally New Orleans, where she was purchased as part of a lot by a man named William Thornton. Thornton owned a cotton plantation called Magnolia Grove in Madison County, Mississippi, about 90 miles north of where Ruth had been born. He had bought the infant not because he wanted her specifically, but because she came bundled with a group of other enslaved people he was acquiring to expand his labor force. The bill of sale listed her simply as female infant, approximately 4 months, good health. No distinguishing marks. Her blue eyes were not mentioned. Her origins were not known. Her connection to the Hargrove plantation had been erased. Ruth spent her early childhood in the slave quarters of Magnolia Grove, raised by an older woman named Bessie, who had lost her own children to sale years earlier. Bessie was the one who gave her the name Ruth, taken from the Bible story of the woman who had said, "Where you go, I will go." It was a name of loyalty and devotion, and Bessie, hoped it would bring the child luck in a world where enslaved people needed all the luck they could find. She noticed early that Ruth was different from other children. The girl was quiet, watchful, absorbing everything around her with those strange blue eyes that made some people uncomfortable and others suspicious. She rarely cried. She rarely complained. She observed. By the time Ruth was 5, Bessie had realized the child's mind worked in ways she had never seen before. Ruth could remember conversations word for word, even conversations that had happened weeks earlier. She could count without being taught, adding and subtracting numbers most enslaved children never learned to manipulate. She could predict when the overseer would make his rounds, somehow understanding the patterns of his behavior better than adults who had lived on the plantation for decades. And most remarkably, she had taught herself to read. No one knew how this had happened. Enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read under Mississippi law. The punishment for teaching a slave to read was severe, and the punishment for a slave caught reading was even worse. Whipping, branding, mutilation, death. These were the consequences awaiting anyone who dared to give enslaved people access to the written word. Yet somehow, at 5 years old, Ruth could look at newspapers that blew across the yard and understand the words printed on them. She could read the signs posted around the plantation, the labels on boxes, the names carved into tools. She had decoded the mystery of language entirely on her own, through observation and pattern recognition, and a mind that refused to accept limitations. Bessie understood immediately that this ability was both a gift and a death sentence. If the wrong people discovered Ruth could read, the child would be destroyed, not just punished, destroyed, made an example of. Slaveholders couldn't afford to let other enslaved people see that one of their own had acquired knowledge without permission. It would challenge everything they believed about the inferiority of black people. It would suggest enslaved people were capable of learning, thinking, becoming something more than property. So Bessie taught Ruth the most important lesson of her young life. She taught her to hide. Ruth learned to pretend she was ordinary. She learned to look confused when white people spoke about things she understood perfectly. She learned to stumble over simple tasks she could have completed with ease. She learned to make herself invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. This was the strategy that would keep her alive. This was the mask she would wear for years. And she wore it so well that when she was 7 years old and brought to work in the big house of Magnolia Grove, no one suspected the quiet girl who cleaned floors and emptied chamber pots was smarter than anyone in the building. The mistress of Magnolia Grove was Caroline Thornton, and she was unlike any white woman Ruth had ever encountered. Caroline was 43 when Ruth came to work in the big house. She had been married to William Thornton for 22 years and had given him 5 children, 3 of whom had survived to adulthood. She managed the domestic operations of the plantation with efficiency and precision, keeping detailed records of every expenditure, every purchase, every transaction that passed through her household. She was educated, having attended a female academy in Charleston before her marriage, and she read voraciously, ordering books from publishers in Philadelphia and New York that took months to arrive by mail. Caroline noticed Ruth almost immediately. There was something about the way the girl moved through the house, the way her eyes tracked conversations, the way she positioned herself to overhear discussions that shouldn't have concerned her. Caroline began watching Ruth the way Ruth watched everyone else, and what she discovered fascinated her. The girl was listening, not just hearing, but actively listening, processing, understanding. When Caroline discussed household accounts with her husband, Ruth's eyes would flicker toward the numbers on the page. When Caroline read letters aloud, Ruth's lips would move almost imperceptibly, following the words. When Caroline left books lying open on tables, Ruth would linger nearby, her gaze fixed on the text. Caroline decided to test her suspicions. She left a note on her dressing table, a simple message that read, "If you can read this, touch the blue vase." Then she hid and watched. Ruth entered the room to collect laundry as she did every morning. She saw the note, read it, and after a moment of hesitation, touched the blue vase. The discovery changed everything. Caroline should have reported Ruth to her husband. She should have had the girl punished according to the law. She should have made an example of her, demonstrating to every enslaved person on the plantation what happened when they acquired forbidden knowledge. That was what society expected. That was what the system demanded. But Caroline Thornton was not entirely a creature of her society. She was curious. She was intelligent. And she was bored beyond measure by the narrow life plantation mistresses were expected to lead. She began meeting with Ruth in secret. She tested the girl's abilities systematically, presenting her with increasingly difficult texts and mathematical problems. She discovered Ruth could not only read, but could comprehend complex arguments, analyze information, draw conclusions from evidence. The girl's mind was extraordinary, perhaps genius level, by any standard. Caroline had never encountered anyone, white or black, male or female, with such raw intellectual capacity. And she began to wonder what would happen if she cultivated that capacity instead of destroying it. The partnership that developed between Caroline Thornton and Ruth was unprecedented and dangerous. On the surface, nothing changed. Ruth continued to work as a house slave, performing the same menial tasks she had always performed. But in private, Caroline began educating her systematically. She taught Ruth advanced mathematics, including the accounting methods she used to manage the plantation's finances. She gave Ruth access to books on history, geography, science, philosophy. She trained Ruth to analyze documents, detect inconsistencies, and identify patterns others missed. Within 2 years, Ruth understood the Thornton plantation's operations better than William Thornton himself. Caroline began using Ruth's abilities for her own purposes. She had long suspected the overseer was stealing from the plantation, skimming profits from cotton sales and falsifying expense reports. But she had never been able to prove it because she lacked the time and expertise to audit years of records. Ruth accomplished in 3 weeks what Caroline couldn't have done in 3 years. She cross-referenced sales receipts with shipping manifests, identified discrepancies between reported and actual production, traced payments to vendors who didn't exist. She documented everything in a report Caroline presented to William, and the overseer was dismissed within a month. This success convinced Caroline Ruth was too valuable to waste on domestic labor. She began deploying Ruth as a secret weapon in the Thorntons' business affairs. When William received correspondence from cotton factors in New Orleans, Ruth would read the letters and identify potential deceptions. When neighbors proposed business partnerships, Ruth would analyze the terms and calculate whether the deals were truly advantageous. When disputes arose over property lines or water rights, Ruth would research legal precedents and suggest strategies for resolution. All of this was done invisibly. No one outside the household knew the Thorntons. Improved business acumen was actually the work of a teenage enslaved girl. The arrangement continued for nearly a decade. Ruth grew from a child into a young woman, and her abilities grew with her. By the time she was 17 in the spring of 1849, she had become indispensable to the operation of Magnolia Grove. She managed the household accounts. She drafted correspondence Caroline signed with her own name. She maintained files on every business associate, every neighbor, every person who might affect the Thorntons' interests. She knew secrets that could destroy families. She understood financial arrangements even the parties involved didn't fully comprehend. She had transformed herself from property into something far more valuable. But she was still property, and that contradiction was about to catch up with her. Caroline Thornton fell ill in March of 1849. The doctors called it a cancer of the womb, a diagnosis with an inevitable prognosis. There were treatments available. Painful procedures involving caustic chemicals and heated instruments. But everyone understood these merely delayed the end. Caroline bore her illness with the stoic dignity plantation mistresses were expected to display. She continued managing her household until she could no longer rise from bed. She continued directing Ruth's work until she could no longer speak clearly. And she died on May 15, 1849, leaving behind a grieving husband, 3 adult children, and a 17-year-old enslaved girl who had been her secret partner for 10 years. William Thornton was 58 when his wife died. He was a practical man, not given to excessive emotion. But Caroline's death affected him more deeply than he had anticipated. They hadn't married for love. Their union had been an arrangement between families, a merging of land and resources that benefited both parties. But over 22 years, something resembling love had developed between them. He had relied on her judgment. He had trusted her management. He had never realized how much of the plantation's success was due to her efforts rather than his own. In the weeks following Caroline's death, William began settling her affairs. He reviewed her correspondence, financial records, and personal papers, wanting to understand the domestic realm he had largely ignored during their marriage. In the process, he discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about his wife. He found the files on Ruth. Caroline had kept meticulous records of Ruth's education, accomplishments, and contributions to the plantation's business operations. She had documented everything, perhaps intending to eventually share it with William, perhaps simply unable to resist her habit of thorough record-keeping. The files contained Ruth's analyses of business deals, her audits of financial records, her strategic recommendations. They revealed that for nearly a decade, the most important decisions at Magnolia Grove had been influenced by the insights of an enslaved girl legally forbidden from reading. William's reaction wasn't what Caroline might have hoped. He didn't admire Ruth's abilities. He didn't appreciate her contributions. He felt betrayed. He felt humiliated. He felt afraid. His wife had been deceiving him for years, relying on a slave for intellectual guidance, while he believed himself the master of his own domain. His business partners had been negotiating not with him, but with a black girl hiding behind the facade of his authority. Everything he had accomplished was tainted by this revelation. And there was another fear, deeper and more primal than wounded pride. Ruth knew too much. She had seen the Thorntons' financial records, correspondence, and private negotiations. She knew about debts William had concealed from creditors. She knew about deals structured to evade taxes. She knew about arrangements with neighboring planters that would cause scandal if revealed. She knew secrets that could destroy the Thornton family's reputation and fortune. An enslaved person with this knowledge wasn't an asset. She was a threat, a liability, a danger that had to be eliminated. But William couldn't simply kill her. Too many people knew she existed. The household staff had seen her working closely with Caroline. Other enslaved people knew she held a special position. If Ruth suddenly disappeared, there would be questions, possibly investigations, consequences William preferred to avoid. He needed a solution that would remove Ruth permanently without raising suspicion. He needed her to die in a way that appeared natural, expected, unremarkable. He needed to send her somewhere people didn't return from. He found his answer in Louisiana. The sugar plantations of Louisiana were notorious throughout the South. Cotton was brutal, but sugar was death. The labor required to cultivate and process sugar cane was so intense, so physically devastating, that enslaved people sent to sugar plantations had an average life expectancy of 7 years from arrival. The work began before dawn and continued past midnight during the grinding season. The heat from the boiling houses could reach temperatures, causing permanent damage to workers' lungs and eyes. The machines that processed cane maimed and killed with terrifying regularity. Plantation owners calculated it was cheaper to work slaves to death and buy replacements than to treat them humanely and preserve their health. A healthy 17-year-old girl sent to a Louisiana sugar plantation wouldn't survive long. She would be worked past the point of exhaustion. She would be exposed to diseases thriving in the humid climate. She would be fed barely enough to sustain life. Within a year, probably less, she would die. No one would question it. No one would investigate. It would simply be the expected outcome of the slave system operating as designed. William began making arrangements. He contacted a slave broker in Natchez, specializing in moving human property between states. He negotiated a price, accepting far less than Ruth was worth because his goal was disposal rather than profit. He scheduled the sale for September 15, 1849, giving himself time to manage the transaction discreetly. He told no one his plans, because secrecy was essential to his scheme. But William made a critical mistake. He underestimated Ruth. She knew something was wrong from the moment William discovered the files. She had watched him carefully during the weeks following Caroline's death, reading his expressions, analyzing his behavior, trying to understand what he would do with the knowledge he had acquired. She saw fear in his eyes when he looked at her. She saw calculation, the cold assessment of a man deciding how to dispose of a problem. She recognized the signs because Caroline had taught her to recognize them in business negotiations. William was planning something, and whatever he was planning, it wouldn't be good for Ruth. She needed information. She needed to know exactly what William intended so she could develop a counter-strategy. And she had the skills to get that information because Caroline had trained her well. Ruth began her reconnaissance in late August, 3 weeks before the scheduled sale. She still had access to William's study because she was still responsible for cleaning it, a duty no one had thought to reassign after Caroline's death. She used this access to examine his correspondence, financial records, and calendar of appointments. She did this carefully, methodically, leaving no trace of her intrusion. She photographed nothing. Cameras didn't exist for people in her position. She copied nothing. Written evidence could be discovered. She memorized everything, relying on the extraordinary memory that had served her throughout her life. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. William had arranged to sell her to a broker named James Patterson, operating out of Natchez, specializing in bulk sales to Louisiana sugar plantations. The transaction was scheduled for September 15th. Patterson would arrive at Magnolia Grove that morning, inspect the merchandise, complete the paperwork, and transport Ruth to Louisiana before sunset. By the end of the month, she would be working in the sugar fields. By the end of the year, she would likely be dead. Ruth had 17 days to save her own life. The first thing she did was assess her resources. She had no money. She had no allies among the white population. She had no legal rights of any kind. She couldn't appeal to authorities because the law considered her property, not a person. She couldn't simply run because fugitive slave catchers operated throughout the region. And an escaped slave was worth money to anyone who captured her. She couldn't fight because physical resistance would result in immediate punishment and wouldn't change her legal status. Every conventional avenue of escape was closed to her. But Ruth had something most enslaved people didn't have. She had information. She had spent 10 years accumulating knowledge about the Thorntons, their neighbors, their business partners, their enemies. She knew secrets powerful men wanted kept hidden. She understood relationships and rivalries that could be exploited. She saw connections others missed, and she was willing to use all of this knowledge to survive. The plan she developed over the following days was extraordinarily complex. It required manipulating multiple people simultaneously, predicting their reactions, steering them toward outcomes, serving her purposes. It required perfect timing and absolute secrecy. It required Ruth to think several moves ahead like a chess player, anticipating her opponent's strategies. And it required her to take risks that could result in her death if anything went wrong. The first target was a man named Henry Crawford. Crawford owned a plantation adjacent to Magnolia Grove. He and William Thornton had been rivals for decades, competing for land, labor, and status in Madison County society. Their disputes had sometimes turned bitter, involving lawsuits over property lines and accusations of slave theft. But they maintained a facade of civility because open warfare between planters was considered unseemly. They attended the same church. They served on the same committees. They pretended to be gentlemen, even as they schemed against each other. Ruth knew things about Henry Crawford he desperately wanted kept secret. 3 years earlier, Crawford had entered a business arrangement with a cotton factor in New Orleans that had resulted in significant financial losses. To cover these losses, Crawford had engaged in fraudulent transactions, forging documents and deceiving creditors. Ruth knew about this because Caroline had discovered it during her investigations, and Ruth had helped analyze the evidence. The information had been filed away, never used because Caroline had seen no advantage in exposing Crawford while she was alive. But Ruth saw an advantage now. She began by sending Crawford an anonymous letter. She couldn't mail it through conventional channels because enslaved people weren't permitted to use the postal system. Instead, she arranged for delivery through a free black man who worked as a tinker, traveling between plantations to repair pots and sharpen knives. She paid him with a piece of jewelry she had stolen from Caroline's belongings months earlier, hidden away for precisely this kind of emergency. The tinker delivered the letter to Crawford's plantation and disappeared before anyone could question him. The letter was carefully crafted. It didn't threaten Crawford directly. It didn't demand money or favors. It simply informed him that someone possessed evidence of his fraudulent transactions and suggested this evidence might become public if certain conditions weren't met. The conditions were vague, deliberately so. Ruth wanted Crawford frightened and uncertain. She wanted him looking for enemies, suspecting everyone around him, making mistakes she could exploit. Crawford's reaction was exactly what Ruth had anticipated. He became paranoid. He began investigating his household staff, business partners, and neighbors. He suspected someone close to him had betrayed his secrets, and he was determined to discover who. This investigation distracted him from other concerns and created chaos Ruth could use. The second target was William Thornton himself. Ruth knew William's plan to sell her depended on secrecy. He didn't want neighbors knowing he was disposing of a slave who had been his wife's personal attendant. He didn't want anyone asking questions about why a healthy young woman was being sent to the death camps of Louisiana. He needed the transaction to appear routine, unremarkable, forgettable. Ruth decided to make it remarkable. She began spreading information through the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove. She told other house servants that Master William was planning to sell her, sending her to Louisiana to punish her for something she hadn't done. The servants talked among themselves, as servants always do. They expressed sympathy for Ruth, who had been a quiet and helpful presence in the household. They wondered why Master William would send away someone who had served Miss Caroline so faithfully. These conversations reached the ears of white people, as Ruth knew they would. Plantation mistresses heard gossip from their maids. Overseers heard rumors from drivers. Within a week, the pending sale of Ruth had become a subject of discussion throughout Madison County. People were curious about why William Thornton was disposing of a valuable slave at a discount price. People were asking questions William had hoped to avoid. This attention made William uncomfortable. He had wanted the sale invisible. And instead it was becoming a topic of local gossip. He began worrying someone might investigate, that his reasons for selling Ruth might be discovered, that his secrets might be exposed. He became cautious, hesitant, uncertain. He postponed some preparations, giving Ruth additional time to execute her plan. The third target was the most dangerous. His name was James Patterson, the slave broker who would transport Ruth to Louisiana. Patterson was a professional. He had been trading in human beings for 20 years, learning to evaluate enslaved people the way horse traders evaluated livestock. He looked for signs of illness, injury, disability. He looked for scars indicating punishment, which might suggest a troublesome temperament. He looked for evidence of value, allowing him to demand higher prices from buyers. He wasn't easily fooled and wasn't sentimental about his merchandise. Ruth understood she couldn't manipulate Patterson directly. He had no secrets she knew of, no leverage she could apply. But she could affect the conditions under which he operated. She could change the context of the transaction in ways that might alter its outcome. She discovered Patterson had a competitor. Another broker named Thomas Reed operated out of Vicksburg, and the two men had been feuding for years over territory and clients. They undercut each other's prices, spread rumors about each other's reliability, and occasionally resorted to more direct forms of sabotage. The rivalry was well known in the slave trading community, though most plantation owners were unaware of its intensity. Ruth sent a second anonymous letter, this time to Thomas Reed. She informed him that James Patterson was planning a significant purchase at Magnolia Grove on September 15th, that the transaction would include several valuable slaves, and that Patterson had been boasting about stealing clients from Reed's territory. The letter was designed to provoke Reed into action, creating conflict between the two brokers that would disrupt the planned sale. Reed responded exactly as Ruth had hoped. He arrived at Magnolia Grove on September 10th, 5 days before Patterson was scheduled. He presented himself to William Thornton as a reputable broker offering competitive prices, suggesting William might want to consider alternatives before committing to any particular transaction. His arrival confused William, who hadn't expected competition for a sale he had tried to keep secret. It raised questions about how Reed had learned of the pending transaction. It created uncertainty William found deeply unsettling. While William was distracted by Reed's unexpected appearance, Ruth executed the next phase of her plan. She had been collecting documents for weeks, copies of correspondence, financial records, evidence of the Thorntons' business dealings over the past decade. She had hidden these documents in locations throughout the plantation where they could be retrieved if needed. Now she began deploying them strategically, The first document went to a lawyer in Vicksburg named Samuel Morrison. Morrison had represented the Thorntons in several legal matters over the years, but he had also represented Henry Crawford in the property dispute that had nearly gone to court. He had access to both families as secrets and was known for his discretion. Ruth sent him an anonymous package containing evidence of irregularities in the Thorntons' financial records. Irregularities suggesting possible fraud. The package included a note suggesting Morrison might want to investigate before his reputation became entangled in scandal. Morrison didn't investigate immediately, but he began asking questions, making inquiries, expressing concerns about certain transactions he had previously approved without scrutiny. These questions reached William through various channels, adding to his growing sense something was wrong, that forces were moving against him, that his carefully constructed plans were unraveling. The second document went to the county sheriff, a man named Robert Blackwell. Blackwell wasn't corrupt, which was unusual for law enforcement in Antebellum, Mississippi. He took his duties seriously and had a reputation for enforcing the law. Even when powerful planters preferred, he looked the other way. Ruth sent him evidence of the fraudulent transactions Henry Crawford had conducted 3 years earlier, framing it as the work of a concerned citizen who couldn't stand by while crimes went unpunished. Blackwell opened an investigation. He began questioning Crawford's business partners, examining records, following the trail of evidence Ruth had provided. Crawford, already paranoid from the anonymous letter he had received, became convinced William Thornton was behind the investigation. He believed his neighbor was using the legal system to destroy him, and he began preparing his own counterattack. The conflict between Crawford and Thornton, which Ruth had deliberately inflamed, now threatened to consume both men. They accused each other of betrayal, conspiracy, crimes neither had actually committed against the other. Their mutual suspicion created chaos throughout Madison County, distracting everyone from the quiet, enslaved girl orchestrating events from the shadows. On September 12, 3 days before the scheduled sale, the situation exploded. Henry Crawford rode to Magnolia Grove with 3 armed men. He demanded to see William Thornton. He accused William of orchestrating the investigation against him, trying to destroy his reputation, violating the unwritten rules governing relations between plantation owners. The confrontation took place on the front lawn of the big house, witnessed by dozens of enslaved workers and several white visitors who happened to be present. William denied everything. He had no idea what Crawford was talking about. He hadn't sent letters, contacted lawyers, or informed sheriffs. He was as confused by the investigation as Crawford was. But Crawford didn't believe him. The 2 men argued, their voices rising, hands moving toward weapons. For a moment, it seemed blood would be spilled. It was at this moment Ruth made her move. She stepped forward from the crowd of watching slaves. She walked toward the 2 angry men with a calm deliberation that made everyone stop and stare. Enslaved people didn't insert themselves into disputes between white men. Enslaved people didn't approach armed planters on the verge of violence. What Ruth did was so unprecedented, so unexpected, that both Crawford and Thornton fell silent in sheer surprise. Ruth spoke. For the first time in her life, she spoke to white men as something other than property. She spoke with the confidence of someone who held power, even though the law said she had none. She told them she knew who had sent the letters. She knew who had informed the sheriff. She knew who had orchestrated the chaos consuming both their families. And she was willing to share this information, but only on certain conditions. The conditions were simple. Ruth wanted her freedom. She wanted legal documentation of her emancipation, signed by William Thornton and witnessed by Henry Crawford. She wanted safe passage out of Mississippi, guaranteed by both men, and she wanted it immediately, before the sun set on September 12, 1849. Both men laughed. The idea that an enslaved person could make demands was absurd. The idea that two plantation owners would grant freedom to a slave who had caused them so much trouble was unthinkable. They would simply beat the information out of her. They would torture her until she revealed everything she knew. They would make an example of her remembered for generations. Ruth didn't flinch. She told them she had prepared for this possibility. She told them documents were hidden in locations throughout the county. Documents that would be delivered to newspapers, lawyers, and government officials if she didn't return safely to a specific location by sunset. She told them these documents contained evidence of crimes committed by both men. Evidence that would result in prosecution, imprisonment, and financial ruin. She told them she wasn't bluffing, and she invited them to test her if they doubted her resolve. There was a long silence. Crawford and Thornton looked at each other, seeing their own fear reflected in the other's eyes. They had spent years accumulating secrets, building fortunes on foundations of fraud and exploitation. They had believed themselves untouchable, protected by wealth, status, and the color of their skin. And now a 17-year-old enslaved girl was threatening to bring it all crashing down. William Thornton spoke first. He asked Ruth what guarantee he had she wouldn't release the documents even after receiving freedom. He asked how he could trust someone who had already demonstrated such capacity for deception. He asked what would prevent her from destroying him once she was beyond his control. Ruth answered honestly. She said she had no interest in revenge. She had no desire to see either man imprisoned or impoverished. She simply wanted to live. She wanted to be free. She wanted to walk away from Magnolia Grove and never look back. If they gave her freedom, she would disappear. She would take her secrets with her and never speak of them again. But if they refused, if they tried to harm her, if they sold her to Louisiana, as William had planned, then she would ensure they suffered consequences far worse than anything she had experienced. The negotiation that followed lasted 3 hours. It took place in William Thornton's study, with Ruth seated across from the two men who had enslaved and terrorized people like her their entire lives. They bargained over terms. They argued about guarantees. They threatened and cajoled and ultimately surrendered to the reality that Ruth had outmaneuvered them. At sunset on September 12, 1849, Ruth walked out of Magnolia Grove as a free woman. She carried papers documenting her emancipation, signed by William Thornton and witnessed by Henry Crawford. She carried a small amount of money she had demanded as part of the negotiation, and she carried the knowledge she had accomplished something the entire system of slavery was designed to prevent. She had freed herself. The road from Magnolia Grove led south toward Vicksburg, then west across the Mississippi River into Louisiana, further west into Texas, and eventually into Mexico, where slavery didn't exist and where a black woman with blue eyes might find something resembling safety. Ruth knew this route because she had studied maps in Caroline Thornton's library, memorizing geography, the way she memorized everything else, storing information that might someday prove useful. She hadn't known then she would need to flee for her life. She had simply been curious, hungry for knowledge, unable to resist learning, even when knowledge served no immediate purpose. Now that curiosity might save her. But freedom on paper wasn't the same as freedom in practice. Ruth understood this as she walked away from the plantation that had been her prison for 17 years. The documents she carried meant nothing to slave catchers roaming the roads of Mississippi, men who earned their living capturing black people. and returning them to bondage. These men didn't examine papers carefully. They didn't give accused runaways the benefit of the doubt. They seized first and asked questions later, knowing even a free black person could be sold back into slavery if no one came forward to vouch for their status. The legal system was designed to favor slaveholders, to assume any black person without a white protector was property that had wandered from its owner. Ruth had anticipated this danger. She had planned her escape route carefully, identifying safe houses where she might find shelter, calculating distances between towns, estimating how far she could travel before exhaustion forced her to stop. She had also prepared contingencies, alternative plans she could implement if her primary route became impossible. The months of preparation that had gone into her confrontation with Thornton and Crawford had also produced a detailed strategy for survival. After that confrontation succeeded, the first night of freedom was the most dangerous. Ruth needed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Magnolia Grove before William Thornton could change his mind. Before he could decide the risk of her documents was worth less than the satisfaction of recapturing her. Before he could send men to hunt her down and drag her back for punishment. She walked through darkness, following paths mapped in her mind, avoiding main roads where patrols might spot her, moving with speed and determination that surprised even herself. By dawn, she had covered nearly 15 miles. Her feet were blistered and bleeding. Her body ached from exertion. But she was alive, and she was free, and every step took her further from the life she had been forced to endure. She found shelter in an abandoned barn near the town of Canton, hiding in the hayloft while she rested and planned her next move. She slept fitfully, waking at every sound, terrified someone would discover her hiding place. But no one came. The barn remained silent, except for rustling mice and distant sounds of farm animals beginning their day. She resumed walking at sunset, traveling through another night of darkness and uncertainty. The second day brought her to the outskirts of Vicksburg, a city sitting on bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River. Vicksburg was a hub of commerce and slave trading, one of the busiest ports in the region. Thousands of enslaved people passed through its markets every year, bought and sold like livestock, shipped upriver and downriver to plantations throughout the South. It was a dangerous place for a black woman traveling alone, but it was also a necessary waypoint on Ruth's journey to freedom. She had a contact in Vicksburg, a free black man named Solomon Burke, who operated a small barbershop near the waterfront. Solomon was part of an informal network, helping escaped slaves navigate the dangerous territory between bondage and liberty. He wasn't connected to the organized Underground Railroad, which operated primarily in the Upper South and the North. He was simply a man who believed freedom was worth fighting for, and used his position in the community to assist those who sought it. Ruth had learned about Solomon through the enslaved grapevine, the invisible communication network connecting black communities across the region. She had memorized his address months earlier, adding it to the store of information carried in her remarkable mind. Finding Solomon's barbershop required navigating streets filled with white people who might question why a young black woman was walking alone without supervision. Ruth adopted a persona developed during years of hiding her true abilities. She hunched her shoulders slightly, kept her eyes downcast, moved with the shuffling gait of someone broken by years of hard labor. She made herself look harmless, unremarkable, not worth a second glance. This performance had protected her throughout childhood, and it protected her now, as she made her way through crowded Vicksburg streets. Solomon Burke was a large man in his 50s with gray hair and hands scarred by decades working with razors and hot water. He received Ruth cautiously, examining her papers with the skeptical eye of someone who had seen many forged documents over the years. But the papers were genuine, signed by William Thornton in his own hand, witnessed by Henry Crawford, dated just 2 days earlier. Solomon had never seen legitimate emancipation papers for someone so young, someone showing no signs of the injuries or illnesses that sometimes prompted owners to free slaves who had become unprofitable. He was curious about her story, but wise enough not to ask questions she might not want to answer. He offered shelter in a room behind his barber shop, a small space that had hidden many travelers before her. He provided food, water, and advice about the journey ahead. He warned her about dangers, slave catchers who prowled roads, sheriffs who arrested free blacks on pretexts and sold them back into slavery, ordinary white people who might report a suspicious traveler simply out of malice or greed. He told her the route to Mexico was long and treacherous, that many who attempted it didn't survive, that she should consider whether death on the road might be worse than the life she was fleeing. Ruth listened to Solomon's warnings, but she didn't waver in determination. She hadn't risked everything to gain freedom, only to surrender it now. She hadn't spent months planning escape, only to abandon at the first sign of difficulty. She thanked Solomon for his help and honesty, and asked what she needed to know to survive the next stage of her journey. Solomon told her about a steamboat captain named Marcus Wheeler, who operated a packet boat between Vicksburg and New Orleans. Wheeler wasn't an abolitionist. He wasn't motivated by moral conviction or religious faith. He was simply a businessman who had discovered transporting certain passengers could be profitable if done discreetly. He charged high prices for his services, but delivered cargo safely, asking no questions about origins or destinations. Ruth had money from her negotiation with Thornton, enough to pay Wheeler's fee with some leftover for the journey ahead. The meeting with Wheeler took place at midnight on the Vicksburg waterfront. The captain was a weathered man in his 40s with the permanent squint of someone who spent his life staring into sun and wind. He examined Ruth's papers briefly, more interested in her money than her legal status. He quoted a price nearly double what Solomon had estimated. Ruth had anticipated this and revealed hidden reserves only when necessary. She paid Wheeler half in advance, with the other half promised upon safe arrival in New Orleans. The journey downriver took 3 days. Ruth spent most of that time hidden in a compartment below the main deck, a cramped space modified to conceal passengers, preferring not to be seen. She wasn't alone. 2 other travelers shared the space, a man named Frederick who had escaped a plantation in Tennessee, and a woman named Clara who had purchased her own freedom after years of saving and was fleeing a former owner who disputed the validity of her papers. They didn't speak much during the journey. There was little to say, and silence was safer than conversation that might be overheard. New Orleans was unlike anything Ruth had ever experienced. The city was vast and chaotic, a swirling mix of cultures and languages overwhelming her senses after the rural isolation of Madison County. French, Spanish, and English blended together in the streets. Free people of color walked openly, operating businesses, owning property, living lives impossible in Mississippi. Enslaved people moved through the city alongside their owners, some appearing almost as well, dressed as the whites they served. Others bearing marks of brutal treatment, Ruth recognized from her own experience. The city was a contradiction, a place where slavery coexisted with a significant free black population, where lines between bondage and liberty were sometimes blurred in ways Ruth found both hopeful and confusing. She didn't linger in New Orleans. The city might be more tolerant than the Mississippi countryside, but it was still dangerous for a young black woman traveling alone. Slave traders operated openly in the markets, and kidnappers targeted free blacks who might be sold before anyone noticed their disappearance. Ruth used contact Solomon had provided to find passage on a ship heading west along the Gulf Coast toward Texas and eventually Mexico. The ship was a coastal trader carrying cotton and sugar to markets in Galveston. Its captain was a Yankee from Massachusetts with no particular feelings about slavery, but willing to transport paying passengers, regardless of color. Ruth paid for passage with the last of her money from the Thornton negotiation, calculating she would need to find work once she reached Texas, that her resources wouldn't last indefinitely, that survival would require more than just escape. The voyage along the Gulf Coast took 2 weeks. Ruth spent the time learning everything she could about Texas and Mexico, questioning sailors and fellow passengers about conditions in territories ahead. She learned Texas had been an independent republic before joining the United States in 1845, that slavery was legal there and expanding rapidly as cotton cultivation spread westward, that the Mexican border was porous and poorly guarded, that thousands of escaped slaves had found freedom by crossing into territory where bondage didn't exist. She learned names of towns near the border. Routes other refugees had followed, dangers awaiting those who attempted crossing. She also learned about the Fugitive Slave Act Congress was debating in Washington, a law that would eventually pass in 1850, requiring citizens throughout the United States to assist in capturing escaped slaves, denying accused fugitives the right to trial by jury, imposing severe penalties on anyone aiding runaways. The law hadn't passed when Ruth made her journey, but its approach cast a shadow over everyone fleeing bondage. Even if she reached Mexico, she would never be truly safe as long as the United States existed in its current form. The slave power reached everywhere, corrupting laws, buying politicians, ensuring no black person could ever feel secure. The ship landed at Galveston on October 3, 1849. Ruth had been traveling for 3 weeks, covering hundreds of miles by foot, steamboat, and sailing vessel, passing through territories where she could have been captured and returned to slavery at any moment. She was exhausted, frightened, uncertain about what lay ahead, but she was also alive, also free, and closer to permanent safety than she had ever been before. Galveston was a young city barely 2 decades old, built on a barrier island in the Gulf of Mexico. It served as the primary port for the Republic of Texas and later the state, handling cotton and other goods flowing from the interior to markets around the world. The city had a small free black population, mostly skilled workers arriving from other parts of the South. Ruth found temporary shelter with a family Solomon Burke had recommended through his network of contacts. She stayed in Galveston for 2 weeks, resting and recovering from the physical toll of her journey. During this time, she began to understand her escape wasn't complete, that dangers remained she hadn't fully anticipated. Word of her departure from Magnolia Grove had spread through networks connecting slaveholders across the South. William Thornton hadn't sent men to pursue her as she had feared. He had done something worse. He had placed advertisements in newspapers throughout the region offering a reward for information about a runaway slave, matching her description, claiming her freedom papers were forged, asserting she remained his lawful property despite the documents she carried. The advertisements were lies. Ruth's papers were genuine, signed under duress perhaps, but legally valid nonetheless. But truth mattered less than perception, and perception was that a significant reward awaited anyone who captured the blue-eyed black girl and returned her to Mississippi. Slave catchers began looking for her. local authorities began paying attention to young black women traveling alone. The protection her freedom papers should have provided was undermined by Thornton's campaign of disinformation. Ruth realized she needed to change plans. She couldn't travel openly to the Mexican border. She couldn't rely on established routes other refugees had followed. She needed to disappear, to become someone else, to shed the identity Thornton was using to hunt her. She needed to do what she had always done best. She needed to become invisible. The transformation began with appearance. Ruth's most distinctive feature was her blue eyes, the characteristic marking her for death at birth, and now making her easy to identify. She couldn't change her eye color, but she could make it less noticeable. She obtained spectacles with darkened lenses, the kind people with sensitive eyes wore to protect against sunlight. The glasses obscured her eyes enough that casual observers wouldn't notice their unusual color. They also changed appearance significantly, making her look older and more scholarly, less like the description circulating in wanted advertisements. She changed her name as well. She became Sarah Johnson, a common name attracting no attention, an identity with no connection to Ruth, who had escaped Magnolia Grove. She practiced speaking with a different accent, adopting patterns of free blacks from New Orleans, rather than the Mississippi countryside. She modified posture, walk, mannerisms, becoming someone new in every way she could control. The new identity required documentation. Ruth couldn't use freedom papers Thornton had signed, because those papers identified her as Ruth and would connect her to wanted advertisements. She needed new papers, documents establishing Sarah Johnson as a free woman of color with a legitimate history and legal right to travel. Obtaining such documents was illegal, but not impossible. Forgery was a thriving industry in the Antebellum South, serving everyone from escaped slaves seeking freedom to white criminals seeking new identities. Ruth found a forger in Galveston who produced papers passing all but the most rigorous inspection. Papers establishing Sarah Johnson as a seamstress from New Orleans, traveling to visit relatives in San Antonio. With new identity established, Ruth resumed her journey toward Mexico. She traveled by stagecoach from Galveston to Houston, then by wagon train from Houston toward San Antonio. The journey was slow and uncomfortable, covering territory still raw frontier, passing through settlements barely more than collections of shacks and saloons. But the frontier had advantages for someone in Ruth's situation. People on the frontier asked fewer questions. They cared less about origins and more about whether a person could work, contribute, survive the harsh conditions awaiting everyone in this unforgiving land. She reached San Antonio in early November. The city was a mix of Mexican and American influences, a place where Spanish was spoken as often as English, where the recent war between the United States and Mexico had left lingering tensions between populations. The Mexican border lay just 150 miles to the south, across disputed and dangerous territory, but passable for someone determined enough to attempt crossing. Ruth could see her destination. She could almost touch freedom. But she had learned enough by now to know final miles of any journey were often the most dangerous. She found work in San Antonio as a laundress, one of the few occupations open to black women in the frontier city. The work was hard and pay poor, but it allowed her to save money for the final leg of her journey while maintaining the cover identity she had constructed. She lived in a small room behind the laundry, kept to herself, spoke to no one about her true origins or plans for the future. She had become Sarah Johnson so completely that sometimes she forgot Ruth had ever existed. But Ruth hadn't forgotten. Ruth was still there beneath the surface, watching, analyzing, planning. Ruth noticed when strangers asked questions about new arrivals from the East. Ruth observed when certain men seemed to be watching places where black people gathered. Ruth recognized signs of organized searching, the methodical pattern of hunters closing in on prey. They found her in December. She was working in the laundry when two white men entered and asked for Sarah Johnson. They were professional slave catchers. Men who made their living hunting, escaped slaves and returning them to bondage. They had been hired by William Thornton to track down the blue-eyed girl who had humiliated him, and they had followed her trail across hundreds of miles from Mississippi to Louisiana to Texas. They didn't believe she was Sarah Johnson. They didn't care about her papers. They had a physical description and a substantial reward, and they intended to collect. Ruth had prepared for this moment. She had always known running was only a temporary solution, that eventually she would have to confront forces pursuing her. She had spent weeks in San Antonio, not just working and saving, but also planning, developing strategies for confrontation she knew was coming. She had identified allies and resources. She had studied the legal system of Texas, learning how it differed from Mississippi's laws, what protections might be available in her situation. She had positioned herself to fight. The slave catchers made their first mistake by assuming Ruth would be easy to capture. They were accustomed to taking scared and isolated runaways, people with no resources and no support, seized and transported before anyone knew what happened. They didn't expect organized resistance. They didn't anticipate this target had been preparing for them. Ruth's response was immediate and coordinated. She had previously established relationships with several members of San Antonio's small abolitionist community, white people and free blacks who opposed slavery and were willing to take risks to help those fleeing bondage. When slave catchers arrived, Ruth's allies swung into action. A lawyer named Thomas Bennett appeared at the laundry within an hour, demanding catchers produce legal documentation of their authority to seize anyone. A local businessman named William Cooper filed a complaint with the sheriff, alleging catchers were planning to kidnap a free woman. Several witnesses came forward to testify they had known Sarah Johnson for months and could vouch for her status as a free person. The slave catchers hadn't expected legal opposition in a slave state like Texas. They had warrants from Mississippi, but Texas law required additional documentation for capturing alleged fugitives. Documentation they didn't possess. They had physical descriptions of Ruth, but Ruth had changed appearance significantly, and the woman before them didn't obviously match the description. They had confidence in their authority, but that confidence was being challenged by lawyers, businessmen, and witnesses determined to obstruct their mission. The confrontation played out over 3 days. The slave catchers attempted to seize Ruth directly, but they were blocked by allies and warned by the sheriff that unauthorized kidnapping would result in arrest. They attempted to obtain additional documentation from Texas authorities, but the process was slow and complicated, encountering unusual delays at every stage. They attempted to bribe local officials, but found key officials had already been influenced by Ruth's network of supporters. Ruth used these 3 days strategically. She knew the slave catchers would eventually obtain documentation they needed, that legal obstacles could only delay them, not stop them permanently. She needed to escape before bureaucratic barriers crumbled. She needed to reach Mexico, where American warrants had no authority and slave catchers couldn't follow. On the night of December 15, 1849, Ruth fled San Antonio. She traveled with a guide, a Mexican man named Diego Reyes, who knew the territory between San Antonio and the border and had helped other fugitives make the crossing. They rode horses Ruth had purchased with her savings, moving as quickly as terrain allowed. racing against slave catchers who would surely follow, once they realized their quarry had escaped. The journey to the border took 4 days. They traveled through landscapes Ruth had never imagined. Deserts, scrublands, rocky hills stretching forever under the vast Texas sky. They avoided roads and settlements, following trails only Diego knew. Trails used by smugglers, refugees, and others who needed to move without being observed. They slept during day and traveled at night. Navigating by stars Diego could read like a map. On December 19, 1849, they reached the Rio Grande. The river was low at this time of year, shallow enough to wade across in many places. On the other side lay Mexico, a country that had abolished slavery in 1829. A country where Ruth would finally be beyond reach of American law and American slave catchers. She could see the far bank from where she stood, could see the promised land that had seemed impossibly distant just months earlier, when she had been planning her escape from Magnolia Grove. But the crossing wouldn't be simple. Slave catchers had followed more quickly than Ruth anticipated. Diego spotted them in the distance. 3 riders moving fast along the trail Ruth and Diego had followed. They would reach the river within an hour, possibly less. If Ruth attempted to cross now, she might not make it to the other side before they caught up. The river was wide and current stronger than it appeared. A crossing on horseback would take time Ruth might not have. Diego made a decision. He told Ruth to cross immediately, to push her horse into the water, and ride for the Mexican shore without looking back. He would stay behind to delay pursuers, to give her time to reach safety. Ruth protested. She didn't want anyone else to suffer on her behalf. She didn't want Diego's blood on her hands. But Diego was adamant. He had helped many people escape to Mexico. Some made it, some didn't. He wouldn't let Ruth become one of those who had come so close only to be captured at the final moment. Ruth entered the river. The water was cold, colder than expected, and current pulled at her horse's legs with surprising force. She gripped the saddle and urged the horse forward, focusing on the opposite bank, trying not to think about what was happening behind her. She heard shouting, heard sound of horses splashing into the river, heard a gunshot echoing across the water. She didn't look back. She kept eyes fixed on Mexico, on freedom, on the future she had fought so hard to reach. The crossing took approximately 15 minutes. It felt like hours. Every second, Ruth expected to feel hands grabbing at her, expected to be pulled from her horse and dragged back to American territory. But the hands never came. Slave catchers never caught up. When Ruth finally reached Mexican shore and turned to look back, she saw Diego still in the water. His horse blocking pursuers' path, his body between them and their target. She never learned what happened to Diego after that. She never learned whether he survived or sacrificed his life to ensure her freedom. She searched for information in years that followed, asked everyone she could find who might know. But Diego Reyes seemed to have vanished as completely as Ruth herself had vanished from slave states. He became one of countless unrecorded heroes of the struggle against slavery. A person whose courage made someone else's freedom possible, and whose name was never written in history books. Ruth crossed into Mexico on December 19, 1849. She was 17 years old. She had traveled more than 1,000 miles from the plantation where she had been enslaved. She had outwitted some of the most powerful men in Mississippi. She had survived slave catchers, bounty hunters, and a legal system designed to ensure people like her could never escape. And now, standing on foreign soil for the first time in her life, she was finally, truly, irrevocably free. The first years of freedom were harder than Ruth imagined. Mexico wasn't a paradise. The country was poor and politically unstable, recovering from a devastating war with the United States that had cost half its territory. Areas near the border were particularly chaotic, plagued by bandits, drought, and lingering effects of conflict. Ruth had no money, no connections, no knowledge of Spanish, no skills easily marketable in this unfamiliar environment. She had intelligence, determination, and freedom. For a while, that was all she had. She settled initially in the town of Piedras Negras, just across the river from the Texas town of Eagle Pass. The location was convenient for newly arrived refugees from American slavery, and a small community of former slaves had established itself there over the years. Ruth found work as a domestic servant, a role painfully familiar, but providing food and shelter while she learned language and customs of her new country. She was no longer Ruth or Sarah. She chose a new name for her new life, a name with no connection to anything that had come before. She became Maria Santos, a woman without a past, a person existing only in the present tense. The education Caroline Thornton had given her proved surprisingly valuable in Mexico. Ruth's ability to read and write English made her useful to merchants trading across the border, to lawyers needing documents translated, to officials dealing with American authorities on various matters. As her Spanish improved, she became even more valuable, able to move between languages and cultures, with fluency few others possessed. She began working as a translator and secretary, earning enough to rent her own room and save small amounts for the future. She was building a new life, one word at a time, one transaction at a time. But freedom didn't erase the past. Ruth carried memories of Magnolia Grove with her. The humiliations and cruelties witnessed and endured, the knowledge of what slavery truly meant for those trapped within its grip. She thought about people she had left behind, the enslaved community at Magnolia Grove, with no opportunity to escape, still laboring in cotton fields, while she walked free under Mexican skies. She thought about Bessie, who raised her and named her and taught her to hide. She thought about other children she had grown up with. Sold, worked to death, broken by the system Ruth had managed to escape. She also thought about revenge. William Thornton had tried to kill her. He had tried to send her to Louisiana sugar plantations, knowing she would die there within a year. He had lied about her freedom papers, sent slave catchers to hunt her across half a continent, done everything in his power to recapture her and punish her for the crime of saving her own life. He had treated her as property, a problem to be eliminated, something less than human, and he had never faced consequences. Ruth wanted him to face consequences. The desire for revenge wasn't immediate. In the first years of freedom, survival consumed all attention and energy. But as her situation stabilized, as she established herself in new identity and new country, old anger began to resurface. She had escaped, but escape wasn't justice. She had survived, but survival wasn't victory. Thornton was still living comfortably on his plantation, still owning and exploiting human beings, still believing he had the right to destroy anyone challenging his authority. Ruth began gathering information. She used her position as a translator to access documents and correspondence crossing the border, learning about political and economic conditions in the American South. She maintained contact with the network of abolitionists and escaped slaves moving between the two countries, collecting intelligence about specific plantations and slaveholders. She learned William Thornton was still operating Magnolia Grove. His finances somewhat suffered after chaos she had created during escape, but he remained one of wealthier planters in Madison County. She also learned about growing tensions between North and South over slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had temporarily diffused conflict, but underlying issues remained unresolved. Abolitionists in the North were becoming more vocal and organized. Slaveholders in the South were becoming more defensive and extreme. Everyone paying attention understood current situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, contradictions would explode into open conflict. Ruth saw opportunity in this instability. She began corresponding with abolitionists in the North, using the network of contacts developed during years in Mexico. She shared information about conditions on southern plantations, methods slaveholders used to control property, experiences of those who had escaped bondage. Her letters were articulate and detailed. Drawing on education, Caroline Thornton had provided an analytical skills developed during years managing Thornton's business affairs. She wrote under a pseudonym, protecting identity while making voice heard. These letters attracted attention. Abolitionists recognized information Ruth provided was more detailed and authoritative than what they typically received from escaped slaves. Most runaways came from fields and had limited knowledge of owners' business operations. Ruth had seen inside the plantation system, understood how it functioned economically, socially, politically. Her insights were valuable to people trying to dismantle that system. In 1854, Ruth received a letter from William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator and one of the most prominent abolitionists in America. Garrison had read Ruth's correspondence and wanted to know more about her story. He wanted to know whether she would be willing to share experiences publicly, to become a voice in the growing movement against slavery. He wanted to know whether she would consider coming to the North, where she could speak to audiences needing to understand what slavery truly meant. Ruth considered the offer carefully. Returning to the United States would mean returning to danger. The Fugitive Slave Act was now in effect, requiring citizens to assist in capturing escaped slaves regardless of what state they lived in. She could be seized in Boston as easily as Mississippi, dragged back to bondage despite everything she had done to escape. Mexican citizenship provided some protection, but that protection was uncertain. American slave catchers had been known to operate across borders when rewards were high enough. But Ruth also understood power of testimony. She understood stories could change minds, shift opinions, build political pressure necessary to destroy the institution that had nearly destroyed her. She had survived slavery. She had escaped slavery. Now she had opportunity to fight slavery, to contribute to its eventual abolition, to ensure no one else would suffer what she had suffered. She accepted Garrison's invitation. Ruth traveled to Boston in the spring of 1855, arriving in a city seething with anti-slavery sentiment. The publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin 3 years earlier had transformed Northern attitudes toward slavery, making abstract evil concrete and personal. The Anthony Burns case the previous year had outraged Boston citizens who watched federal marshals drag an escaped slave back to bondage through streets lined with protesters. The city was ready to hear Ruth's story, moved by her testimony, ready to support the cause she represented. Her first public speech took place in Faneuil Hall on May 15, 1855. She stood before an audience of more than 2,000 people, looking out at white faces eager to hear what she had to say. She was nervous, more nervous than during any dangerous moment of her escape, but she had learned to hide fear, to present calm exterior regardless of what she felt inside. She took a deep breath. She opened her mouth. She began to speak. She told them about being born with blue eyes. She told them about the order to kill her, about Hattie's desperate deception, about growing up among people who had saved her life at risk of their own. She told them about Caroline Thornton, the complicated woman who had educated her while owning her, who had given her tools she could use to fight while never questioning the system, making the fight necessary. She told them about discovering the plot to send her to Louisiana, about the 17 days of planning and manipulation, about walking away from Magnolia Grove as a free woman while the most powerful men in Madison County stood helpless to stop her. The audience was transfixed. They had heard escaped slaves speak before, had listened to accounts of whippings, separations, daily cruelties of bondage, but they had never heard a story like Ruth's. They had never encountered a former slave who spoke with such analytical precision, who described mechanisms of the system with such devastating clarity, who had defeated oppressors not through physical resistance, but through superior intelligence and planning. Ruth's story challenged everything they thought they knew about enslaved people. It proved the supposed inferiority of black people was a lie told by those who benefited from that lie. The speech was a sensation. Newspapers throughout the North reported on the blue-eyed former slave who had outwitted her masters. Abolitionists invited Ruth to speak in cities across the region: New York, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago. She became a celebrity of the movement. Her story repeated in pamphlets, articles, sermons. She became proof that slavery wasn't just morally wrong but practically doomed. That the system couldn't survive if enslaved people like Ruth existed, people clearly equal or superior to those who claimed to own them. But Ruth hadn't come to the North simply to tell her story. She had come for revenge. She had never forgotten William Thornton. She had never forgiven him for trying to kill her, for hunting her across the continent, for treating her as something to be disposed of rather than someone to be respected. Now she had a platform. Now she had an audience. Now she had the ability to strike back at the man who had tried to destroy her. She began including Thornton by name in her speeches. She described his plantation, his business practices, his treatment of enslaved people. She detailed the fraud discovered during years managing his affairs. Debts concealed, partners cheated. She exposed him publicly, making his name synonymous with worst excesses of slave system, ensuring his reputation would be destroyed, even if he never faced legal consequences. The exposure had consequences. Northern businessmen who had previously dealt with Thornton began distancing themselves. Banks that had extended credit became more cautious. Cotton factors in New Orleans, purchasing his crop, started offering lower prices, claiming concerns about reliability of shipments. Ruth couldn't touch Thornton directly, but she could damage him economically, could chip away at the fortune built on bodies of enslaved people. Word of Ruth's speeches reached Madison County. William Thornton learned the girl he had tried to send to death was now a famous abolitionist touring northern cities and telling audiences about his crimes. He learned his name was being cursed in churches and meeting halls, that he had become a villain in narrative of anti-slavery movement. He learned secrets Ruth carried hadn't been buried when she escaped. They were now being broadcast to thousands of people who would never forget. The knowledge destroyed him. Thornton died in 1858, 3 years after Ruth began her speaking tour. The official cause was heart failure. But those who knew him understood he had been broken by public humiliation, collapse of business relationships, realization that a slave he had tried to murder had achieved revenge more complete than anything physical violence could have accomplished. He died knowing his name would live in infamy, remembered not as a gentleman planter, but as a monster who had tried to kill a child for having the wrong color eyes. Ruth continued speaking until the Civil War made her testimony unnecessary. The conflict everyone had predicted finally arrived, consuming the nation in 4 years of bloodshed that would kill more than 600,000 people. Ruth supported the Union cause, speaking at recruitment rallies and fundraising events, celebrating each Northern victory as a step toward destruction of the system. She had escaped. When the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in 1863, she wept for the first time in years. Overwhelmed by knowledge that millions would experience freedom she had fought so hard to achieve, she returned to Mexico after war ended, settling in Mexico City, where she lived until her death in 1891 at age 59. She never married. She never had children. She devoted later years to education, establishing schools for poor children, teaching them to read and write, giving them the same tools that had saved her life. She wrote a memoir published in 1878, a detailed account of her escape and experiences as an abolitionist, a document historians would later cite as one of the most important first-hand accounts of American slavery. The memoir began with story of her birth, with Hattie's decision to save her life, with blue eyes that marked her for death, and ultimately became her signature. It ended with a simple statement capturing everything Ruth had learned during extraordinary journey. She wrote she had been born a slave, lived as a fugitive, spoken as an activist, and would die as a free woman. She wrote her eyes had seen cruelty and courage, hatred and hope, the worst and best human beings were capable of producing. She wrote freedom was never given, only taken, and those who waited for permission to be free would wait forever. She wrote she had no regrets. The blue-eyed black girl who should have been killed at birth had lived to see slavery destroyed. She had contributed to destruction with words and witness, and refusal to accept fate the system assigned her. She had proven intelligence could defeat power. Determination could overcome oppression. One person with will to fight could change course of history. She had been impossible from moment she was born. She remained impossible for 59 years of struggle and survival. And in the end, the impossible had won.